Chapter 4, Teach Yourself Navigation. Down the channel at about 3 knots, past the ferry stage, past the various hotels, the golf course, the bathing pool, with the Mombasa lovelies sunbathing. Then hard to port, then starboard, then amidships, and we were headed for the open sea. I used power for the first couple of miles or so, then set the mizzen and main. The northeast monsoon was blowing and would keep in the same direction for the next 3 months. It was blowing at 10 knots, gusting to 15. This I knew because the Kenya Broadcasting Company put out 3 weather forecasts a day, and for the last couple of months it had never varied. Coastal winds 10 knots, gusting to 15, came regularly over the wireless. As long as I could hear the KBC, I duly entered the force and direction of the wind in my log. I headed due east and settled myself down for what I reckoned would be about a 10 or 12-day sail. Buller came and nestled beside me. He liked any kind of travel. Cars, boats, trains were his delight. I lit a cigarette, and wham came a dollop of spray, hitting me full in the mouth. I lit another with the same result, and the same thing happened with the third. I thought probably it had something to do with the set of the sails, but it didn't seem worthwhile to start messing about with sails for the sake of a cigarette. It was a beautiful day, practically cloudless, the sea an intense blue. It was always a bit choppy near the shore, but about 5 miles out to sea it settled down into a nice easy swell, and sailing was a sheer joy. I had fitted a cog and ratchet to the wheel, and I now started to experiment with it, to see if she would hold her course unattended. She wouldn't. She slowly started to veer off to starboard. I knew that she had to have her sails set in a particular manner, and I slacked off the mizzen a bit, but this made it worse. I'd been assured by Jerry that she would sail herself. In fact, he had demonstrated the fact to me, but then we had been sailing on a southerly course, and had a jib set at the time. I eventually thought, to hell with it. I'm not going to start messing about now. I'll wait till tomorrow, when I'll have all day to get the right trim. I was content as I was. At about 6 o'clock, I spotted the Pride of Bombay coming up astern, about 2 miles to starboard, and I immediately altered course in her direction, for, as I have said, I wanted to get dead astern of her and then follow her course. Alas, I found that I had to alter the set of the sails, and by the time I had done that, she was well ahead. I decided to carry on until I was out where she had been, and then head east again. Actually, her course was marked as clearly as elephant spoor. You couldn't miss it. Orange cases, bottles, bits of paper, vegetables, and other odds and ends floated in her wake. I thought, if she keeps this up, it will be like driving along the Great North Road. No need to worry about navigating at all. I felt a tremendous relief, for though I had put a brave front on it, I had had many a qualm about being able to make the islands. For one thing, there is a fiend of a current running north when you leave Mombasa, sometimes at 90 miles or so a day. I'd calculated that every 5 hours I should have to run south for an hour to get on course again. That is, if I kept up a constant speed. Now, being on Bombay's tail, I reckoned that they would have calculated the angle. Obviously, they wouldn't do any plumb line stuff, and as I would be sailing at the same angle, my worries would be over. To this day, I don't know why, but it never occurred to me that the refuse would be drifting north with the current. I had resolved that on this, the first night out, I would not sleep, but make up with cat naps the next day, after I had managed to get her to sail herself. It was now about 7, and night came down with its usual tropical suddenness. Being well in the shipping line, I switched on my lights, also the wireless, and listened to the news. I forget what was on, probably boring speeches by politicians. I watched the full moon come up and felt at peace with the world. I lit a cigarette. Bang! Smack in the face, as usual. I waited a few minutes and tried again. As usual, that dollop of spray got me. This time Buller also got a wetting, which cheered me up and disgusted him. It suddenly occurred to me to wonder what speed I was making, and looked at the dial of the log, only to discover that I had forgotten to chuck it overboard. There it was at my feet in the cockpit. I hastily streamed it out, and found that we were doing 4 knots. I now did my first sum. At this speed I should do about 100 miles a day, but every 5 hours I must alter course and sail south for an hour, which was 5 hours wasted, or 20 miles a day, till I got out of the current. Those were of course approximate figures, and no doubt my speed would vary a good bit. I had 1,000 miles to do. Well, that worked out at roughly what I had calculated, 11 or 12 days easy sailing. After that, I should have to keep a pretty sharp lookout if I was not to sail head-on into some atoll or reef. But that worry was in the future. Meantime, I wouldn't have much to do. It did not take me long to revise that idea. About this time, Buller began to get a bit restive, and I realized that he had had neither food nor water that day. I too felt like a snack, and a nice hot cup of coffee had definite attractions. I opened a tin of dog meat for Buller, and decided that I would have some lamb chops and chips myself. I fried up the lot in one pan. My frying pan was one I was rather proud of. It had sides 6 inches deep. I had bought it specially because I figured that with sides like that, fat and food would not slop over the side. I may say that it worked perfectly, and I seldom had any grease slopped about. Twice during my cooking operation, I had to rush up and get her on course again, and I vowed that I would keep on experimenting next day until I had found out how to make her sail herself, even if it meant trying every sail I had and setting every combination in every possible way. The meal cooked, I carried it up into the cockpit, together with my thermos of coffee. Having eaten the chops and chips, I leaned over the side and shoved the plate into the water to wash it, only to have it whisked out of my hand by the pressure of the water rushing by. This annoyed me considerably, as I had a high regard for my crockery. When I bought a Huru, she was completely fitted up with every conceivable kind of plate, cup, glass, etc., but I had visualized it getting smashed in rough weather, and had given the lot away, and bought a new lot of everything made of plastic. It looked the real stuff, even to the willow pattern, but it was completely unbreakable. To have a plate of my best dinner set lost with my first meal did not augur well for the future, nor was that the only disaster. My thermos had, of course, a very wide top, and just as I started to pour my first cup, the ketch gave a sudden pitch to port, and caused me to slop nearly all the scalding coffee over my legs, and a gallon of hot coffee over you is not to be laughed at, apart from the actual loss. I solved this problem the next day in the following manner. I flattened out a tin and cut it in a circle 2 inches larger than the circumference of the thermos. I then bent down the sides of the tin, making a lid. In this lid I made a small hole. Therefore, whenever I wanted to pour coffee, I took the cork out, fitted my lid on, and poured through the hole. I never lost any more coffee. Buller again became restive and started to whine, a very rare occurrence with him, and it struck me that he was in desperate need of a tree. He was always an exceptionally clean dog, and must have been extremely worried. I took him up forward, pointed to the small bollard on the lee side, and made encouraging noises. The poor chap either did not understand, or couldn't believe it. After a few minutes of this, he still didn't seem to grasp what I meant, as I thought the only thing to do was to set an example, which I did. This satisfied him. If I could do it, he could. From that time on, he regarded the bollards as his private heads. The only thing that distressed him was that he found it practically impossible to balance on 3 legs in rough weather, and every time he was sent off balance, he would let out a thunderous growl. I never discovered whether he was blaming and growling at the boat, the sea, or just the cussedness of things. I now checked the course, and settled down at the wheel for the rest of the night. About midnight, the wind freshened considerably, with frequent, quite hard gusts, which caused me to heel over in what I then considered to be a dangerous angle. It was, of course, nothing of the sort, but I was perhaps understandably nervous on this, my first time out absolutely alone. Up to that day, I had always had either Jerry or one of his boys with me. Now there was no one to ask advice or help me when I made silly mistakes. I slacked off the mizzen and main, and this eased her considerably. I thereby lost a bit of speed, but that worried me not at all. Even today, I cannot understand this obsession with speed. In my philosophy, if you like sailing, and the longer the voyage, the more you sail, and the happier you should be. After all, if the idea is to get from England to Cape Town quickly, you can fly it in a matter of hours. If, however, you like sailing, then the longer it takes you, the better. You're doing what you like. The various magazines that cater for yachtsmen are full of adverts for various gadgets that will add knots, save days, ensure a quicker trip, and so on. The only times I feel any urgency is when I am a day or so from port, and then I admit that I cram everything on in order to reach the flesh pots quickly. There is always an excitement about making a landfall. If it's a port you know well, then there are old friends to meet again. If it's a new place, then there is the possibility of exciting happenings, strange meetings, new experiences. With contrary winds, I have been known to use the engine for the last couple of days, but once I am away from land, with a nice long voyage ahead of me, all urgency departs, and I am content to amble. As I mentioned before, I once crewed as engineer cum cook in a race from Australia to New Zealand, and a more uncomfortable trip I never had in my life. The skipper was a madman. Day and night we seemed to do nothing but set, stow, alter, and trim sails. He was never satisfied. Gunwales under was the rule, no time for cooking, and in retrospect, it seems to me we never had 5 minutes undisturbed sleep. Another thing which I didn't discover until we had sailed, he would allow no hard liquor aboard. A hell ship, if ever there was one. Despite all this, we were tail-end Charlie, arriving half a day after everyone else. In my opinion, it served us right. Truly, the racing fraternity are a race apart. According to my old log book, nothing of note happened that first night. The wind eased off towards morning, and as soon as dawn broke, Buller and I had breakfast. Bags of bacon, eggs, and tomatoes. Breakfast over, I started to keep my vow. I tried all combinations of sails, set in every different way I could think of, and eventually found that if I reefed the main down to about the same size as the mizzen, and used the Tyrolean jib, she would roughly hold her course. She veered often to port and starboard, but by and large kept in the right direction. It was about midday before I hit this happy combination, and I found that I was dead tired. The excitement of actually starting, sitting up all night, and on top of that, heaving all those heavy sails about, had really exhausted me. I did not trouble to have anything to eat, but swallowed a cup of coffee, gave Buller some biscuits and water, and collapsed on my bunk. I slept solidly till 5 o'clock, and awoke with a start feeling that something was not as it should be. I was out on deck in a flash, and looked hastily about. Everything looked all right, and then I realized that there was no wind at all. The sea like glass, with just a long swell, no ripples even at all. The sails were not flapping, and everything seemed so still. She was broadside on to the swell. I looked at the log, and found that we had apparently done 10 miles during the time I was asleep. So I reckoned that we had been becalmed about 3 hours. Well, I thought, this suits me. I'll cook myself a whacking meal, and catch up on some more sleep. Accordingly, according to my journal, I cooked and ate a meal, the thought of which now makes me shudder. 3 pork chops, chips, onions, rolls, butter, a whole tin of pears, cheese, biscuits, and apparently still feeling peckish, I topped this off with an apple flan, which I'd bought before I sailed. Buller certainly ate the chopped bones, though I have not recorded it, but I have said that he also got 2 tins of bully and 2 bars of chocolate as a treat. Both comfortably bloated, we retired to our bunks. I suddenly thought that here was a good chance to heat up my stew again, which I did, remembered to switch on my lights, and finally dozed down. I awoke shortly after midnight to find that conditions had not changed. There was still not a breath of air. This surprised me more than somewhat, as I had always thought that the trades blew steadily and solidly in one direction without a let-up. Certainly along the coast they did not vary more than a few knots for months on end, and I had been led to believe that they would remain steady all the way to the islands. I was a bit worried about drift. By dead reckoning, at any rate, according to the log, I had clocked up 120 miles, sailing east, and all my guesses about drift were nothing more than guesses. Well, there was nothing I could do about it. There was no use worrying. Meantime, I might as well enjoy myself. I had a cup of coffee and opened a new box of cigars, and lay down on the deck, looking at the stars. Buller came up and joined me, and we had a long conversation about the infinity of space, life on Mars or other planets, but came to no definite conclusion. We must have both dozed off, because I jumped up in a fright. The sails were making a fearful bang and clatter. The wind had returned. Not only had it returned, it started to really blow. It was, of course, merely one of those sudden squalls that are so frequent in the Indian Ocean, but they can sometimes be really fierce. They seldom last long, though. However, I was ignorant of this at the time, and to me it seemed that a mother and father of a storm was coming up. I stumbled forward and started to get the jib off her, and suddenly remembered that Buller had not his lifeline on. I scrambled back to attend to that, and went forward again to finish the job. She was dipping her nose right in, but then paid off, and started running before the wind. I was soaked. It was pitch dark, and everything seemed to be tangled up, and not in its right place. I remember thinking that I must practice handling sails with my eyes shut. That way I would not be fumbling about, as I was now. It seemed to take me ages to settle with the jib, and then I had reefed the other 2 sails right down to almost nothing. Had I not had roller reefing, I doubt if at that time I could have managed. I then set about bringing her on course again. I'd been warned that I must never let her jibe if I could avoid it, and I had visions of being dismasted when I brought her round. However, nothing happened, except that at this moment it started to rain in buckets. I could not be any wetter than I was. In fact, I remember thinking that the rain would wash the salt out of my pants, which was all I was wearing. The wind dropped as suddenly as it had started, and went back to the old 10 knots, gusting to 15. Shortly afterwards, the rain stopped too, and I had time to look round a bit. Buller wasn't there. With my heart in my mouth, I made a dash below to see him hanging by his lifeline about halfway down the companionway. He hated rain, and no doubt had endeavored to go below. He always jumped down and climbed up. However, he was none the worse for his hanging, and in fact seemed a bit sheepish about the whole affair. I called him all sorts of a landlubber for giving me such a fright, and being such a cowardly custard. I felt rather bucked. I had imagined I survived a storm, and without any damage either. Couple of real sailors, Captain Slocum and I had gained more confidence in my boat, and also in myself, which was more important. It is of course amusing to look back now, when I have been in real storms that never seemed to end, and that left me exhausted and fearful that I should never come through them. But remember that I was an absolute tyro then, who had never experienced even a squall in a small boat. Up went the main and mizzen again, but not the jib. I'd had enough of that one. That could wait till the morning, when I could see what I was doing. The sea had not had time to get up, though there was a small cross sea running, which started up that blasted dollop of spray again. Towards morning the wind moderated again, and about an hour after dawn there was only sufficient to push us along at about 2 knots. It was, however, a beautiful morning, and after breakfast I decided to do some fishing. There were 2 fine rods aboard, with terrific reels on them and plenty of lures. I picked out a nice multicolored one, attached it to the line, and heaved it over, letting out about 60 yards of line. There is a leather slot affair in the cockpit, specially made to take and hold the rod, and I fitted the rod in and waited hopefully for a strike. Hardly had I started to fish when the wind died away again to nothing. The line sank and hung straight down. I left it there. In passing, I may say that the most successful lure I have come across is shark skin, cut into strips about 8 inches long and 2 wide. It almost shines in the water, and has the added attractions of being capable of being used time and time again, and costing nothing. And anything that costs nothing has a definite appeal to our fraternity. I decided to start swatting up my navigation. I had 4 books on navigation, one of which was astral, and said to be the easiest. This, however, called for heavenly charts, and a knowledge of the various stars, as I could only recognize the Southern Cross and Orion's Belt. I decided to learn that at a later date. I therefore selected a teach-yourself navigation. I read about halfway through, and realized that I was just as ignorant as when I began. The only way to do it, I reasoned, was to thoroughly learn a chapter at a time, So I went back to the beginning again. I grasped the theory easily enough. My trigonometry was pretty good. I knew about angles, was used to calculating, and foresaw no great difficulty in mastering all the arts of global navigation. I was itching to take a sight, and got out my sextant to be ready at noon. Meantime, I turned up the chapter on how to take a sight. Let me get a sight, I thought, and it does not matter if it takes me all day to work it out. I shall know where I was at noon, and can calculate where I am afterwards by dead reckoning. After all, it was just a matter of elementary mathematics. At about 5 minutes to 12, I switched on my wireless and took up position amidships. For the last half hour I had been peering through the sextant to get the hang of the thing. As the time pips came on, I peered confidently and got what I thought was a perfect sight. That was that. Feeling a bit peckish, I decided to have a meal first before working out my position. After lunch, I went below, got out the chart table and charts, and set to work. I will draw a veil over the next couple of hours, sufficient to say that the day's entry in the log reads, "Seemed to be off the bloody earth." It remained absolutely calm until about 6 o'clock, when a fair breeze got up, and we slowly forged ahead. What with all the drifting about I had probably done, I had not much idea of where I was. However, I still believed that I should make the islands without too much trouble, and relied on my dead reckoning. The patent log did not seem to be working too well, going in fits and starts, and I discovered that it had got well and truly tangled with my fishing line, which I had forgotten all about. I hauled them both in, and spent the next hour untangling them. It was now of course quite dark, and I settled down to another night. It suddenly struck me that I need not keep peering into the compass. I could pick out a star and sail on that bearing. I duly picked one out dead ahead and steered on that. After about an hour, I realized that the darned thing was not where it had been some time ago, and then remembered that they do shift about, or rather planets did, but stars kept position. Or was it the other way around? I reasoned that the Earth was a planet, and that went round the sun, and the sun was a star, so it was evidently the planets that moved about. But which were planets and which were stars? I gave it up and went back to the compass. You will probably think that I was obsessed with navigation, and in a sense I was. I desperately wanted to hit the islands, if only to confound all the people who I knew had betted against my doing so. It was really a matter of pride, I suppose. Actually, it did not really matter. I was bound to hit somewhere if I kept on sailing east, and I was provisioned for a year, and there was no one to worry about me if I did not turn up at Mahi. At the same time, I liked to do what I set out to do, and I had read about a chap with about as much experience as I had, who had set out, hit Madeira bang on the nose, and in fact made all his ports. If he could do it, I didn't see why I couldn't. Anyway, I was going to have a hell of a good try. Nothing seems to have happened that night, or the next day. The wind held steady, and I spent my time swatting and having cat naps. It seemed, and still does, an ideal life. Eat, sleep, read, listen to the wireless, sunbathe, fish, sail, and completely one's own master. I thought of all the poor people in London, catching tubes and buses, frightened of arriving late at the office, hating their work and their bosses, planning out their budgets, putting this on one side for the income tax collector, that for the rent, this for telly and washing machine installments, appalled when they found a new baby on the way, wondering if they could send young Alfred to a good school, and the chaps at the other end of the scale who suffered agonies when steel dropped a point, worried about the political situation, watched the bank rate like hawks, fiddled expense accounts, and had expensive and discontented wives to support. I thought about the politicians running about maneuvering for power, breaking pledges because they later appeared to be inconvenient, of Macmillan's wind of change speech and all the misery it had caused by encouraging Africans to rise against Europeans. I remembered Makiros, convicted of being the head of a murder gang, and later being feted in England. I thought about these things, and sincerely thanked God that I was out of it all. In future, I would be subject to no government, pay no taxes, be free of all the pettifogging rules and regulations imposed upon the little man. I started to add up all the restrictions under which we suffered. Gold, you must hand it over to the government in exchange for a piece of paper. Diamonds, you are not allowed to be in possession of uncut stones. Even your eating and drinking were controlled. It was a criminal offense in England to buy a drink after 11 p.m. in many towns. In South Africa and Australia, women were not allowed in bars. If you signed a check, the government had its whack with a stamp. In fact, in any private transaction, the government was sure to get its cut. Licenses, permits galore beset one on every side. And for what? For one thing, so that armaments could be bought to kill you and other little people, to pay salaries for loads of officials, civil servants, inspectors, snoopers of all sorts. I'm no communist, but I'm against all this control of one's life. Doing my so-called duty and working to pay taxes. Ah well, at last I was free. It was a wonderful feeling. I was jerked from these wonderful thoughts by Buller reminding me that he had not yet had his chocolate. Some kind lady had recommended me to take lots of raisins and nuts, as they were so sustaining. I thought I would try some now, as I did not feel like having a meal. I must admit that they are satisfying for a short period, but I certainly could not live on them, as some chap did for weeks on end. Buller, however, loved them, and whenever in future I took a handful, he managed to get most of them. The wind seemed to have settled down nicely, and I decided to set the jib. Jerry had told me that she sailed a real treat on her 4 lower sails, but I was slightly scared of setting too many sails because I knew that I should never be able to manage them if another of those squalls came up. Besides, speed did not matter to me, although I thoroughly enjoyed the exhilaration of bashing along at a good rate. Give me time, I thought, and I'll get all the right sails set at the right time. In actual fact, a ketch of the size of a huru is quite a job for one man to handle, especially in times of trouble. One feels one must stay at the helm in case she jibes, gets pooped, or half a dozen other things, and at the same time one has to abandon the helm in order to reef, etc. Many and many a time I wished I had someone to take over the wheel whilst I attended to the sails. All I could do was to lash the wheel and hope for the best. Actually, lash is the wrong word. I had fitted a fairly fine-toothed wheel and ratchet to the helm before I sailed, and all I had to do to hold the rudder in the desired position was to flick the ratchet lever over, and she would be held quite firmly. The next entry in the log reads, "Quiet night, rosy-fingered dawn, with wind backing and ending abeam about midday. Running nearly gunwales under, about 4 inches freeboard, logging 6 knots. How's this for nautical language?" I'm afraid I cheated. I had a paperback book entitled Cruising by Peter Heaton with me, which gave a list of nautical terms, and I had looked up the correct words with which to describe the shift of wind. I was still liable to think of the front end and the right and left sides of the boat, but was doing my best to think and speak in a proper sailoring manner. I used to startle Buller by suddenly yelling out, "Helm a lee, brace the mainsail, claw to windward, box the compass," and other inane remarks. I should never dream of doing such a thing if there was anybody to hear me, but when one is so completely alone, sometimes it is a comfort to hear a human voice, even if it is only your own. Other chaps have told me since that they often bawl out nonsensical phrases after a week or so of lone sailing, one admitting that he often shouts out all the cuss words he can think of, and finds great solace in doing so. I have no voice, but nevertheless nowadays sing as loudly as I can, especially when having a good run. I'm sure that it's good for you to get it off your chest, so to speak. I met a fellow in Samoa who was a single-hander and had acquired the habit of talking to himself so much that he spoke practically every thought aloud. To the great embarrassment of everyone present, he would say, "I don't like the look of that. Looks a proper bastard," on being introduced to someone, and I once heard him, after thanking a popular hostess for a nice party, say, "God save me from these boring cows and their parties." Fortunately, the lady in question was aware of his idiosyncrasy, and was also a good sport. She merely grimaced at me and laughed. At any rate, we singers and shouters don't talk to ourselves. I again tried my hand at taking a sight, but had no better luck than before. I forgot where I landed up, but it was not even in the Indian Ocean. I spent the afternoon still swatting up navigation, but at about 4 o'clock found it a bit of a bore and chucked in. Glancing idly to port, I noticed that about 1/4 of a mile away the sea was being a bit agitated. There seemed to be a tremendous amount of splashing going on the surface. I suddenly realized what it was. It was a terrific school of flying fish, the first I had seen, and they were being attacked by something, and what was more, heading directly for us. Buller also noticed the commotion and started to growl. I yelled out, "Stand by to repel boarders," and in half a jiffy flying fish were coming aboard, all over the boat. They were hitting the sails, and falling down on deck, falling into the cockpit, and in fact all over everywhere. I have never before or since seen such a huge school. The bombardment was all over in a minute, the battle passing away to starboard, and vanishing in the distance. I was unable to identify the attackers. They were racing along just under the surface, but from the short glimpse I got of one or two, I imagine they were barracuda. I collected 22, saved 6 of the biggest, and threw the rest back. 2 I cooked on the spot, and jolly good eating they were in fact. I think that after trout, they are my favorite fish. The other 4 I filleted and gave to Buller. This act of charity was a definite mistake, because from that moment he developed an unholy passion for them, and since then it has been a battle between us as to who can first grab any fish that comes aboard. He has an advantage, being much quicker off the mark than I, and further spends a lot of time on the lookout for them. Although an obedient dog in most things, he just cannot resist them, and bawling out to him to let it alone falls on deliberately deaf ears. A couple of gulps and the fish has vanished, the bones seeming not to hurt him at all. However, I still manage to grab about 1 in 3, and they always make a most welcome addition to the larder. Chapter 5. The Great Calm. At about 7 o'clock, the wind started to die away, and by 10 it had fallen completely. Although I did not know it, this was the start of the event which I named the Great Calm. If I had known where I was, I might have obtained undying fame by naming the whole area Ricky's Doldrums. I liked to think of future skippers warning each other of the dangers of becoming becalmed in Ricky's Doldrums. However, I anticipate. At about midnight, I snuggled down on deck and slept till dawn, which came up red in the morning, shepherd's warning. I thought and looked forward to a resumption of the wind. Nothing happened, and by 8 o'clock it was still a dead calm. I wandered all over the boat, inspecting the rigging, for wear, but could find nothing. I started and checked the engine, polished the brass work, oiled and greased everything that could be oiled and greased, rigged up a wire fore and aft, running so that Buller could have the run of the whole boat when wearing his safety harness. He was never allowed on deck without it, and gave him a good wash down in fresh water. If his coat is allowed to get too salty, it makes him itch. Dotted about the boat were several of those patent life-saving waistcoats, guaranteed to keep you afloat for a terrific number of hours. I sat in the cockpit and thought about these. It seemed to me that if one fell overboard wearing one, then undoubtedly one would float about in the sea for hours, if a shark didn't get you first. Meanwhile, your boat would be merrily sailing away, and in a very short time you would just be left in the middle of the ocean with no hope at all of living. I didn't like the prospect. I am a strong swimmer, and did not fancy what would undoubtedly be a long, drawn-out death. Better, I thought, to get it over quickly and drown as soon as possible. I made up my mind that I would never wear one. For the record, I never have. My journal for that day reads, "Fiddled about generally, tried out echo sounder, but got no response. Evidently no bottom here at all. Deck pretty hot to the feet. Determined not to start engine. Found that there were about a dozen small fish, all about a foot long. Blue backs with black markings. Look like mackerel, but obviously not, as I don't think they are found in the Indian Ocean. Tried to catch one, but they don't seem to like anything I tried. Still under the stern when I went to bed. If no wind tomorrow, shall really get down to this navigation business." The next morning the dead calm continued. There was not a ripple on the sea, nor a cloud in the sky. I remembered being told when I was once in Berbera that it had not rained there for 5 years, and I wondered if I had struck a similar sort of place. What was so annoying was that by all accounts, and by all authorities, the monsoon should have been blowing. The Indian Ocean trades, in fact. Uhuru lay broadside on, rolling slightly from the long, barely perceptible swell. I wondered how far, how fast, and to where I was drifting, north, south, east, or west. There was one way I could have got my position, or rather found it. I knew that I could be only a few hundred miles from Africa, and when the wind came, if it ever did, I could do an about turn and sail west until I hit the coast. I was in no doubt but that I was north of Mombasa, so all I had to do was to sail south on sighting the coast, till I came to some place I recognized, such as Lamu, or at the worst, Mombasa again, and once more take off from there. But such a course seemed to me to be a confession of failure. If I was spotted, and I had little doubt but that I should be, I should never be able to live it down. I could picture the superior smiles of various nautical types, and all the "I told you so's." Not to hell with it. I'd sail on and hope for the best. There was nothing to do but laze about. I did not feel like getting on with my study of navigation, nor did I feel like reading. I had lots of books by chaps who had sailed single-handed round the world, not once but twice, some of them. From reading which I had hoped to pick up a lot of tips. They all seemed to have such interesting adventures that they depressed me. Seldom did they strike a day when the wind wasn't at least force 4, and generally 7 or 8, and if by some chance they got becalmed, then whales would play around them, sharks and interesting fishes would follow the boat, or at the very least an albatross would perch on the main mast. With me, nothing happened at all. A few days before I left, a chap on the Mombasa Times had given me a journal with instructions to write it up, send it to him when I had completed the voyage, and said his paper would be interested in printing some of the more lurid events. I had bunged it into a locker, and thought no more about it. It now occurred to me that it might be a good way to pass some of the time, and I went below to rout it out. I opened the locker in which I had dumped it, and had a most delightful surprise. There, in the locker, was a case of rum. Scrawled in crayon on it was, "Hope you live to drink it, Jerry." It was the work of a moment to open it, and extract a bottle. There is only one way to drink rum, and that's neat. Besides, drunk out of the bottle, it saves washing up, and wear and tear on your crockery. I carried it up into the cockpit. "Buller," I said, "we're about to splice the main brace." He muttered something about waiting till the sun was over the yard arm, but as captain I was not having any of that nonsense. Though by no means a teetotaler, he loves beer. He has sense enough to stay off spirits. I took a long, satisfying gulp. It was jolly good rum. The day passed slowly, and I dozed down on deck early that night. It must have been about 10:30 when I was startled by a succession of most ghastly screams. At least that was what it sounded like to me in my half-awake state. I sat up in a fright, only to be instantly knocked flat on my back by a heavy body dressed in white. My first thought was pirates. I had been warned not to go near the coast in the Red Sea, because it was not unknown for small sailing ships to be attacked by them. Whatever it was that had flattened me was still on top of me, and I let out a terrific punch, and slipped from under. I could hear Buller having a terrific scrap, and there was a devil's own din going on. I was by now fully awake, and I jumped down into the cockpit, where I kept a large, heavy torch. Grabbing this, I faced forward, determined to sell my life as dearly as possible. By accident, my hand encountered the switch, which operated the deck and masthead lights, and I instantly switched both on. An unbelievable sight met my eyes. The whole boat was smothered in pelicans. There must have been about 20 aboard, 2 of which were corpses, and Buller was engaged in battle with a third. He had it by the throat, and was shaking it, and would no doubt bite its head off, as he had obviously severed the 2 dead ones. The one that I suppose I hit was flopping about the deck, and when it came upon me of the dead ones, it started to give it tremendous bashes with its extremely formidable-looking beak. For a moment or so I did not know what to do. I just stood and gaped about me in wonder. There were feathers and blood galore. The birds were still making a fearful row, and I now noticed that there were a lot more paddling around the boat and also joining in the chorus. I don't know how long I stood there. No doubt it was not as long as it seemed. I switched my torch on, and in its beam I saw that Buller was covered in blood. Whether his own or not, I didn't know. But anyway, the sight roused me to action. I jumped out on deck and made for Buller, who at this moment apparently decided that he had finished with that one and was making a dive for the one that was flopping about. I grabbed him up in my arms and, avoiding several birds, undid his harness and, to his tremendous disgust, bundled him below. A quick check satisfied me that the blood was not his. Indeed, when I cleaned him up and examined him in the morning, there was not a mark on him. I then went back and sat in the cockpit. Rum, I thought, and went below again, and brought the bottle up with me. After a real man's tot, I felt a lot better. Now what the devil was I going to do? Should I sling the lot overboard, or let them rest till the morning, when they would, no doubt, take off again? While I thought the flopper went overboard, but seemed to be able to paddle around all right, I decided to do nothing about them, and after about an hour, several more came aboard. They had to paddle away some distance, and then managed to take off. Their landing was extremely clumsy, many in fact hitting a sail, and in one or two instances a mast. Those aboard kept up a continual sort of chattering with their pals afloat, who were always ready to reply. Apart from the fright I had had, the arrival of these birds worried me considerably. All the pelicans I had ever seen had been, if not on the shore, at any rate not far off. I had never heard of them flying long distances, and when I had seen them flying, they had always been only a few feet off the sea. I remembered seeing them on Seal Island off Cape Town, which is about 14 miles out to sea, but never had I heard of anyone encountering them hundreds of miles from land. Had they come from some island fairly near? Was I possibly near the Seychelles Islands, or had I drifted practically back to the African coast? Actually, I had never seen such a large flock, and wondered if by any chance they emigrated. They flew in a V formation, at least they had when I had seen them previously. But surely, if they were on a long-distance flight, they would have been flying pretty high, and not low enough to hit the boat. Or perhaps they had flown a hell of a way, and were exhausted, and seeing the boat, seized a chance for rest. It was almost worrying. I wished I'd been awake when they arrived, so that I could have seen the direction from which they came. At any rate, I made up my mind to be awake when they left, and to take a very careful note of which point of the compass they were heading for. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the cockpit, having occasional swigs of rum to soothe me, and quite a lot of coffee to keep me awake. Meanwhile, I studied the birds. Now that all the fuss was over, they seemed quite at home. Some cleaned themselves with their ridiculously long, ungainly beaks. Others tucked their heads under their wings and unconcernedly went to sleep, and others strutted about, sometimes hanging over the gunwales, talking to their pals, who paddled round continually. One in particular kept walking up to the edge of the cockpit and peering at me before waddling away. After he had done this several times, I stretched out my hand, thinking to give him an encouraging pat or something, but he just made a hefty snap at me, and I hastily withdrew. After this had happened several times, he took up permanent station, fixed me with his beady eye, and appointed himself a sort of sentry. Every time I moved, he took a swipe at me, and I took jolly good care not to get within range. If he was guarding the rest of the flock, I take off my hat to him and salute him as a brave leader. As soon as dawn broke, and it seemed a hell of a time breaking, they all set up a clatter. One by one they all flopped off the boat and paddled around with their pals. If there was any sort of signal, I didn't see it, but they suddenly paddled like mad and rose as one man. They went round the boat twice before they got in their V formation, and then headed off a couple of points south of east. I took very careful note of this, and I may say that it did not help me a bit. In fact, I cannot imagine now why I should have thought it would do. I was no nearer knowing where I was than I had been the night before. I now went below and cooked Buller and myself a good breakfast, afterwards cleaning him up. I now had the job of cleaning the deck and getting rid of the bodies. I wondered if they were good to eat, and to this end I cut off a leg, plucked it, and gave it to Buller. He politely took it in his mouth, held it a few seconds, and then dropped it. If he, who could eat anything, couldn't stomach it, it was a cinch that I couldn't. I heaved the carcass overboard. A long streak flashed up and seized the remains, and the whole lot vanished in a flash. A shark, my very first shark. All this excitement was too much. Pelicans, sharks, all within a few hours. Any moment now I should be getting whales and typhoons. Buller was barking his head off. He evidently regarded the pelican as his personal property, and took an extremely ugly view of a shark snitching it. To console him, I told him we would catch the shark, nail its tail to the bowsprit, and bring the wind. Old shellbacks believed in this, and well, dash it, you never know. So I got the other carcass, and removed a wing. I then got a hefty hook, and put a 1/4-inch manila on it, and cunningly concealed the lot in the wing. I explained to Buller that the essence of shark catching was to give it confidence, and then cunningly betray that confidence. I was bursting with cunning. I now threw the remains of the second bird over, but it floated for about 10 minutes before there was the same dash and flurry, and it disappeared. I wondered whether the shark liked feathers, and whether it often took pelicans and other sea birds when they were resting on the water. I thought that it might emulate a snake, which digest all the meat and regurgitate the horns of buck, and might spew out all the feathers. If it did, I didn't see it. Now, I told Buller, we'll wait a while, and then catch him with this wing. I duly waited about a quarter of an hour, and then threw my line out, quite close to the stern. Up dashed the shark, and I tensed myself for the coming tug-of-war, only to watch him sniff the bait, turn round, and assume a position about 10 yards astern. I stole a look at Buller, but he was tactfully gazing into space. The wing had been nice and bloody, like the rest of the carcass, and I could not see why he had not taken it. Of course, I thought, he might be full. After all, they were two pretty big birds. Several times during the day I tried again, but although he would rush up, he always scorned the bait. Meantime, I washed and scrubbed the deck. Luckily, the blood was all on one strip of canvas, because I was unable to get the stains out, and in fact, although I replaced this strip in India, underneath there is still a faint stain on the woodwork to this day. Having finished these chores, I retired to the cockpit and again thought about those pelicans. I reasoned that I could not be near shore, as I had seen no other birds, and although seagulls are rather scarce birds on the east coast of Africa, surely, had I been comparatively near the coast, I should have seen some species of sea-bird. From pelicans, I began to think about birds in general. I had recently read, in the Reader's Digest, I think it was, and also in another magazine, that birds do not fight for mates, but to protect territory. Also, that their singing is not really singing for the joy of it, but to warn other birds off their chosen area. These two articles were written by the usual expert, probably, like so many experts, self-acclaimed. Now I can tell you, in fact, I categorically state that this stupid theory is tripe. Birds don't fight for territory, neither is their singing a warning. I am no expert on birds, but I have eyes and can reason from what I see. Let's take this fighting for territory first. Have these experts never seen a rookery? Don't all these rooks live and build their nest close together, sometimes even building 3 nests on one branch? What about pigeons? You can see hundreds of them nesting in and about many a large building in London. St. Paul's, for instance. Swallows will often have 10 nests along the eaves of one roof. Have they never even seen a picture of a penguin nursery, where you can hardly walk without stepping on a nest, or a cliff full of puffins' nest? Ah, the experts will say, we are thinking more about birds that migrate. Then you have fallen into my trap, chum. Flamingos migrate each year to breed, now on Lake Nakuru, and also Lake Ilmanitia, which are situated in Kenya, about 1 hour's run from Nairobi, and are the principal breeding grounds of flamingo. You can see an estimated 1.5 million, yes, 1.5 million of flamingos lining all the shores in the breeding season, and in fact most of the year. The estimate is not mine. It is that of various naturalists and official government wardens and a host of bird watchers. I've watched them for hours and never seen a fight. Again, take African finches. Along the northern frontier district of Kenya, you can see flights of thousands of them at a time. They will all alight and feed together over a fairly small area, then take off as one man to go to water in the evening. I've seen bush with thousands and thousands of nests of these small birds, all living in harmony. Take a look at a weaver bird colony, and you will see perhaps a couple of hundred nests hanging from half a dozen trees. Why, the very use of the words flock and colony prove that birds are not solitary people, but like to live together. When I was a very young child, my old nanny used to make me listen to the chorus of bird songs in the evening and also at dawn. She told me, and I believe her, that they sang to please God in the morning, and sang at night for keeping them safe all day, and that small boys had to say their prayers morning and evening for the same reason. I take my stand with my old nanny against all these silly experts. She would have made very short work of them, I can assure you, and boxed their ears for talking a lot of nonsense. For the next 3 days the calm persisted, and apparently nothing happened that was worth recording in my journal, for the pages are blank. Neither are there any entries in the log. At dawn on the 4th day I came on deck to be greeted with a marvelous sight. About a mile to starboard, a large freighter was apparently hove to, or going ahead very slowly. I could not decide which. The sight of it excited me out of all proportions. I was terrified lest it should sail away without me having a chance to speak it. I scrambled down the hatchway and hurriedly brought up my Aldous, only to find that I had neglected to connect it to the batteries. It was the work of a moment to hurl myself down again and connect it. While I had been in intelligence during the war, I had been well grounded in Morse, a fact that I blessed at the moment. It was still pretty dark, and ideal for signaling. My fingers were all thumbs as I got the Aldous into position. Hell, I thought, what if she isn't English and can't understand me? Well, here goes to find out. I take the following from my journal. Sighted a freighter this morning, very excited after all this time. Seemed to be hove to, so flashed the following message. Do you want a tow? Got no response, so again signaled. Do you want a tow? After what seemed ages, but was probably 10 seconds, she flashed back. You saucy bastard. She was English. I've never been so glad to be called a bastard before. With hardly a pause, she asked, Are you all right? The following conversation then took place. Yes, I'm fine, but where am I? Wait. Then they gave me my position, but I could make nothing of degrees this and minutes that, so signaled. Means nothing to me, cannot navigate. How do I get to Seychelles Islands? Blimey, you're in a bad way. Wait. Sail 380 miles south, then east 590. Thank you, will do. Sure, there's nothing you want. Only wind. Eat beans. Who are you? Will report you. Catch a hooroo out of Mombasa, bound Seychelles Islands. Don't report. Never lived down being so much off course. Admire your guts. Good luck. God bless you. Thank you. He has. Who are you? Santa Claus. With that parting information she put on speed, and gradually disappeared. I watched her till she was hull down, then went below to mark my position. At long last I knew where I was. I carefully measured 590 miles west of the islands, then 380 north, and put a beautiful circle in red ink on the spot. I was surprised at the distance I must have drifted. How I could have got over 300 miles, nearer 400 miles to the north, completely defeated me. There must have been a hell of a current all the way, or else my compass was out. I discounted the latter, and was inclined to the theory that she had not been steering herself when I was asleep as well, as I thought she had. Anyway, I now knew where I was. The incident had cheered me up beyond measure, and I sang as I set about all the little jobs that came up, and although I was lucky enough to get the next flying fish that came aboard, I gave it to Buller so that he could have a bit of joy as well. If only the wind would come. Sailing south, I should have the wind almost dead astern, and I knew that she would then sail herself without any deviation. The sun came up with its usual intensity, and there was no sign of even a cloud. There seemed, however, to be a certain heaviness difficult to describe about the sky, and I lived in hopes of a breeze later. In fact, I thought that there was the possibility of a storm. I should have welcomed this even if only to break what was coming to be a boring monotony. I could, of course, always have started up the engine and got to hell out of it, but a stubborn pride, or perhaps it was sheer cussedness, forbade this easy solution. Even today, I will not start up and use power unless entering or leaving port, or in case of dire necessity, such as being on a dangerous lee shore, or in danger of being run down. If I am to be honest, I must admit to having a thing about it. I always carry a terrific amount of fuel, and really there is no danger of me ever running out. But I have known several craft that came to grief on reefs through having run out of fuel or engine failure, and this is an absolute nightmare to me. I sometimes, when a day or so out of my landfall, proceed on the engine, but then I know I shall be able to replenish my supplies as soon as I make port. As for engine failure, I never begrudge any money spent on it to keep it in absolutely first-class condition, so that it starts up at a touch. Also, I always give it a really good overhaul before sailing, stripping it right down. For the next 3 days my log reads, "Calm, more calm, no end to this bloody calm." I was not idle during this period. One seldom is afloat. I studied that cursed navigation, took sights, but never was I able to place myself in near proximity to where I knew I must be. 50 or 60 miles would not have worried me, but I seemed to land all over the globe. It was infuriating. I could not see where I was going wrong, but wrong I was, every time except once, when I seemed to be fairly near the position that I had been given by the friendly freighter. This gave me hope, but hope was dashed by subsequent sightings, which as usual made nonsense. Dead reckoning is all right when one is moving, but I was just drifting about, with the log hanging straight down, and did not know the rate or direction of the drift. During this time, I decided to rid myself of my friend the shark. He was still with us. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to reappear. He had taken to swimming alongside now, and again, and he and Buller used to glare at each other. I swear the shark could see Buller as clearly as we could see him, because sometimes he would roll on his side a bit to get a better view. Buller evidently regarded him as a sort of superior flying fish, for he would wag his tail and grin down at Sharky. It was getting too uppish altogether. I tried him with all sorts of bait, but although he would swim up and sniff, he would never bite. I had a tin of stuff which was guaranteed to kill bugs. The label explained that it smelt like human blood, and that the bugs would lap it up, only to find that it was poisoned. Well, I knew that sharks were attracted by the smell of human blood, or any sort of blood for that matter, and I reckoned that if I soaked something in this bug mixture, the shark would absolutely gulp it down. There was a large old sponge board, which appeared to serve no useful purpose, and it seemed an ideal medium. I got out my largest hook and carefully sewed the sponge all round it. When all was ready, I soaked it in the bug stuff and heaved it over about 3 yards in front of the shark. He didn't hesitate. He surged forward, and his jaws closed over it with almost an audible snap. A second afterwards, I gave the line a terrific jerk, so as to get the hook well and truly in him. Out came the hook, minus the sponge, and I swear the damn thing grinned. Well, I finished cursing and decided to watch him and see whether the poison would take effect on him. He thrived on it. I had used up the tin and could not try this again. One of the tools of my trade is dynamite, and I had some sticks and detonators aboard. You never know when it might come in useful, and I thought about floating a stick in a box until it was about over him, and then blowing him out of the sea. But the trouble was he would never get far enough astern to make it safe. I didn't want to blow a ruddy great hole or start a leak in the boat, and reluctantly gave up the idea. I tried to spear him, and after about 20 throws, managed to hit him on the back, but he merely sheared off, leaving the spear hanging on the end of the line. I began to be obsessed with the brute. After all, my intelligence was presumably far above his, and there must be a way to nobble him. Other chaps of whom I had read simply put out a line and heaved them in without any trouble at all. I decided that my shark was a kind of Moby Dick among sharks, yet malignant and cunning to the nth degree. It would need a lot of thought to outwit him, but I would do it no matter what the cost. I began to study his habits, and found that his usual practice was to shear off about dusk, and be away on his private business, presumably getting food, then reappear about midnight, stay with us for about an hour, then vanish again till dawn, when he would always hold an inspection before taking up station astern. His method of inspection never varied, and I supposed that he wanted to assure himself that we were both present and correct. He would approach quickly from any direction, then slow down about 10 yards off, and cruise slowly right round the boat. As he came alongside, if Buller was looking at him, and he generally was, the shark would pause for quite a time, whilst he and Buller eyed each other. He would also inspect me in the same fashion, but it was Buller that seemed to take his fancy. I must have been pretty dim not to have thought of the method much sooner. I merely shot him. It wasn't as easy as that. I had brought a couple of guns aboard, a 2.2 repeating rifle, and when I left the Congo, I had brought out my old and trusted .350 elephant gun, a 4.45. I had had to abandon, but as I was leaving the land of elephants, in any case, this didn't seem to matter much at the time, though I have since regretted it. I loaded the .350 already, and waited for the dawn inspection. True to form, he carried out the usual maneuver, and paused to eye Buller. On these occasions he came very near the surface, seeming to be about a foot under water, and I did not think that I should have to allow for refraction at such a shallow depth. At any rate, I made no allowance at all, but drew a careful bead on where I judged his brain to be, and pulled the trigger. I don't know what I expected, but I certainly thought he would thresh about a bit, as I thought sharks were pretty difficult to kill, and I was prepared to put 1 or 2 more in him if necessary. What happened was that he didn't seem to bat an eye, but slowly rolled over and started to sink. The water was crystal clear, and I could see his white belly for several fathoms down. When he was practically out of sight, there was a sort of flurry of something, but I could not make out what it was, whether another shark or some other fish attacked him, or whether he at that moment came round, I don't know, but we never saw him again. My logbook for this period says, "No more till something happens. Nothing to record." My journal says, "See log." The result is that I don't know how many days that cursed calm lasted. Day after day we sat and drifted with the current. There was certainly no wind to push us anywhere. It must have lasted about a fortnight, I think, and although there were on occasion several little breezes, they were definitely of the zephyr variety, and not enough to fill a sail. In fact, I never troubled to set one. Every morning I would anxiously scan the horizon in the hope of seeing a sign of changing conditions, but there was never any indication of a change. I got stubborn. I would sit there till a wind did come. If I sat there a year, fortunately I did not have to sit that long. When the calm ended, it ended with a vengeance. Chapter 6. A Bump. on the head. On the last evening of that horrible calm, I was sitting in the cockpit reading a chapter on nautical knots, and practicing with a piece of string. It was getting fairly dark, when I was startled to see a flash of light. This was so unexpected that both Buller and I jumped up. As we did so, there was another flash to port. Lightning. It was too dark to see whether there were any clouds on the horizon, but by the frequency and brightness of the flashes, I reckoned that there was either a storm coming up, or the mother and father of a squall. In any case, I had to do something about it, but what? If it was not too bad, then I would set the sails, and at long last get cracking. If, on the other hand, it was going to be a hell of a blow, then it seemed to me that I had better get ready to ride it out. With this end in view, I set the mizzen so as to keep her head on, and waited to see what Father Christmas would bring me. I set the mizzen and waited. It seemed ages whilst I sat at the helm, watching the lightning and wondering. I suddenly remembered Buller, and bundled him below, only just in time as it turned out. Without the slightest warning, a terrific gust hit us, almost died away, and was followed by another gust of greater intensity, and the wind was bitterly cold. I had hardly had time to notice this fact when down came the rain, unaccompanied by an ear-splitting clap of thunder. At the same time, a hooroo heeled right over to lee, with half the deck awash. I swung the wheel and waited in agony till she came head-on. Why the mizzen didn't go, I don't know. Then it really started to blow. I had never realized before the terrific noise wind can make screaming through the rigging. The rain was practically horizontal, and I could see nothing except the compass, and even with the good light I had put in, it was difficult. For about the first quarter of an hour or so, the sea remained fairly calm, but then it started to get up, and to add to my misery, the binnacle light suddenly failed. That light had been a comfort to me. Up till then, I had been able to keep my head down, and the rain out of my eyes. Now I had to look forward, so as to be sure of keeping my head on. Not that I could see much, but I could see the crest of the waves. After a time during which I seemed to be battling with the helm, I found that the mizzen was doing all that was required, and was holding her nicely. I very bravely, and no doubt wisely, decided that a hooroo knew more about riding out storms than I did, and decided to leave her to her own devices. I then remembered that I should have put on my safety belt. This was attached to the back of the cockpit seat, and I hurriedly slipped it on. At least I should not now be swept overboard. Today, of course, I should go below till the storm had blown itself out, but then I was frightened to do this. I felt that at all cost I must be on hand to deal instantly with anything that came up, not that I in all probability should have known what to do, but there might have been something. I felt round the cockpit to make sure that the axe was there, in case a mast went, and I had to cut it adrift before it bashed a hole in the boat. People always seemed to be doing this. I also found the torch and turned it on, but switched off hurriedly. The waves looked too horrible. When I couldn't see them, it wasn't too bad, but now that I knew what they looked like, I could not understand how a boat could possibly climb up them. However, she was doing it, and I sent up a prayer that she would keep on with the good work. She did. I don't know what force the wind was, but it was certainly pretty well up the scale. The barometer would doubtless have warned me to expect something, but the last few days I had not even glanced at it, with the result that I was entirely unprepared. Now and again a sea would break over us and come sweeping along the deck, flooding the cockpit, but she drains remarkably quickly, and in actual fact, once I realized that we were not going to be swamped, I rather liked it, as the sea was considerably warmer than the rain. This is the only time I remember rain making me feel cold. I have sometimes perhaps put my hand on my chest and found that it felt icy cold, but that apparently was only my skin, and I myself felt quite warm. I don't know whether the human skin has insulating properties, but I think it quite possibly has. Otherwise I see no reason why I should not have been cold all over inside as well as outside. This does not apply if one has clothes on. Then, if you get wet, you get cold right through, which is why I always strip for a storm. Normally, I only wear a pair of shorts when afloat. To get back to that night, the wind seemed to wax and wane. Sometimes it would drop for a minute or so, only to come back with renewed fury. After a couple of hours, my arms were beginning to ache. I was hanging on to the seat, like grim death, to save myself being chucked about. I tightened up the lines of my safety belt until I was practically tied to the back of the seat, and then let it hold me to give my arms a rest. I could not stick this long, as the belt cut into me too much. I was naturally being thrown about quite a bit. However, with frequent changes from arms to belt, I managed to sit it out. At about 4 o'clock, the rain eased off, and the wind seemed to be moderating a bit. I longed for the dawn. One always does in a storm at night. Why this should be, I don't know, as a storm can be just as dangerous in the daytime. However, all the yachtsmen I have ever met agree that they greet the dawn during a storm with heartfelt relief. At 5 o'clock it was definitely blowing itself out, and by 6, when the first bit of gray appeared in the east, it had dropped to, I should think, about force 5 or so. I sat on until the first rays of the sun appeared, then rose somewhat stiffly to go below. I opened the hatch, and a ghastly sight met my horrid eyes. The cabin was about a couple of feet under water. As I said, I had been caught unprepared, and had completely forgotten to open the skylight, with the result that every sea that came aboard, to say nothing about the rain, sloshed into the cabin. poor Buller was sitting on my bunk, wet through and miserable. As an encore, he had been sick all over my pillow. Naturally, with all that water sloshing about, everything was soaked, right up to the ceiling. Buller made a dash to get out on deck, away from this horror, but I stopped him, as the sea was still high. Fortunately, the skylight had not been fully open. Why, I don't know, as it always was, or I should undoubtedly have been swamped, and probably sunk. I could not remember nearly closing it, but suppose I must have done so, unless my guardian angel did it for me. The engine was out of commission, all the leads, etc., being wet, and there was nothing for it but to get busy on the hand pump. But first, a reviving cup of coffee, with a whacking tot of rum in it. Seldom has this delectable mixture been so welcome and delicious. I had 2 cups of this, and then a cup without rum, and felt more able to tackle things. I gave Buller a good helping of my hot stew, and this cheered him up a bit. Then I got on the pump. It was not easy going, as the boat was pitching very much indeed. At the end of about an hour I could see that I was making some impression, but I was whacked and had to rest. I went up on deck and had a good look around, but there seemed to be no damage that I could see at the moment. The sea was still pretty steep, but it was obvious it was gradually abating. I debated whether to start setting the sails and getting a move on at long last, but decided that the first thing to do was to get the water pumped out. Again I got on the hand pump, and after about another hour, by which time my arms felt like lead, the water had fallen so that the engine was not now being deluged every few minutes. It took me another good hour to get the engine started, and once started, I switched on the power pump, and had the pleasure of seeing gallons being pumped out at about 10 times the rate at which I had been able to effect with the hand pump. I could now take stock. Everything was soaked, and as the water receded, I discovered articles on the floor that by rights should have been hanging up or on shelves. The whole cabin was a shambles, and I did not look forward to the job of tidying it all up. I decided to have a good hot breakfast, the inevitable stew, but on opening my thermos, I found that the stew had gone sour and was inedible. There was nothing for it but to start cooking. I had never essayed this job before, with the boat pitching as she was at the time, and experienced all the well-known difficulties. Thrown off balance on one occasion, I foolishly put my hand on the hot stove to save myself from falling, and naturally got burnt, though not badly, my hands being wet at the time. I eventually managed to cook myself a good whack of porridge, and heated up a tin of kippers. I also replenished my thermos of coffee. Breakfast over, and feeling more of a man, I set about tidying the cabin. Fortunately, the pillow on which Buller had been sick was of foam rubber, and I chucked overboard the pillowcase and merely had to wash the rubber. The bedding consisted only of the mattress and a sheet, and these I had to leave till I could dry things out when the weather improved. I replaced all the articles in their proper places, making some more secure than they had been. All this took a great deal of time, and it was only when a shaft of sunlight came through the skylight that I realized that it was past noon. I rushed on deck, and Buller scrambled up after me. Oh, what a treat to see the sun! The blue sky was dotted with small white clouds, and I certainly had a wind at long last. Now I could start to run south. I debated what sails to set, and came back to my old main and mizzen. Once set, I headed her off, expecting to find the wind dead astern. Why I expected this, I don't know, but in fact it was a few points off. However, we were going along at a fine clip, 6 knots actually, the fastest we had ever achieved. Unattended, she would not hold her course due south, but would hold it reasonably well a few points east of south, which suited me admirably. When I reached the end of the leg, and as I mentally thought of it, turned left, I should not have so many miles to run, probably 100 less. I did not anticipate much difficulty in working out the angle. I kept at the helm till about 9 o'clock, and then decided to heave to for the night. I didn't want her to veer off, and go herring off on some ghastly course. The next morning the conditions were the same. Greatly daring, I set the jib. The wind had dropped a bit, but with the jib set she came back to her 6 knots. This was really sailing. To add to our happiness, flying fish began to come aboard again. Not only that, but when I decided to do a bit of fishing, I got a strike immediately. I threw the line out and pulled in a kind of kingfish. In fact, it might have been a kingfish. Elated at my success, I immediately tried for another. I had visions of getting half a dozen and then drying them out, thus having a supply on hand. But although I had a line out all day, I caught nothing more. The sea had by now gone down, and I was getting nice long swells and a good stiff breeze. The boat looked like washing day in Tooting, being festooned with articles I had hung out to dry. The cabin was now merely damp, not soaking, but had a definite musty smell. However, that would clear up in time. Meanwhile, I had nothing much to do, or rather nothing that I had to do but sit and steer. This suited my idle temperament well. It would have suited me even better if I hadn't to steer. However, I was well content. I decided that I would spend the nights in future hove to, and do my sailing by day. I hoped that this arrangement would stop me darting up on deck umpteen times during the night to check the course. Hove to, I could come to little harm. Besides, with a good night's sleep, I reckoned that I could attend to the helm for at least 16 hours a day, and at 6 knots. If I could keep that up, I should average about 100 or more miles a day. My log reads, sailing over the ocean main, 6 knots and better, wind favorable, lovely day. I had now read through my book on navigation, I don't know how many times, and seemed to be no forwarder. Although, to the best of my knowledge, I followed the instructions implicitly, I did not seem to get anywhere, or rather, I got everywhere except where I should have been. It seemed to me that one could not learn it properly from a book, and needed someone to teach you. I therefore chucked all ideas of mastering the art, until I could obtain a competent instructor. I did not doubt but that I should find one in the Seychelles Islands, willing to teach me. It mattered little to me how long I stayed there. I therefore decided to relinquish all ideas of learning on my own, and stopped taking those useless sights. My decision rather relieved me. No more swatting. I could be even lazier. I calculated that I had done roughly 200 miles on the southern leg, and at this rate, say 2 more days before I turned left. I marked up my chart very carefully, reckoning that at the angle at which I was sailing, I should have knocked off about 100 miles from the eastern leg, leaving me 490 or say 500 only to do. In 7 days, merely 1 week, I should make landfall. All the next day I kept up my 6 knots, sailing merrily along in perfect weather. About 8 in the morning I hove to, but found that I couldn't sleep. I spent most of the night in the cockpit, cat-napping, and having the odd cup of coffee. I felt rather excited. Tomorrow evening I should be at my turning point. At the crack of dawn I was off on the last 80 miles. I watched the log like a hawk, checking and rechecking my speed and distance. It was rather gusty, so that I was sometimes clocking up 5 knots, sometimes 6, and on one occasion, for about half an hour, I was doing just on 7. I sat in the cockpit with my pencil and pad of paper, 60 miles to go, 50, 38, 20, and then the wind started to fall. It died away, as it generally does in those latitudes in the evening, until I was what seemed to me to be crawling at a mere 3 knots. Up till then the wind had held until about 8 at night, but I was to find that mostly it drops toward sundown. However, I considered that I had made very good time, and was not unduly depressed. Another 6 or 7 hours should do it. I was determined to stick at the helm until I made it, if it meant sailing all night. At 11 o'clock I had 2 miles to go, and prepared to snug down for the night. I reckoned that the wind would probably blow me in the right direction for a couple of miles during the night. I felt that a celebration was called for, and opened a bottle of my precious champagne. It was warm, but what cared I? Tomorrow I would be off on a new tack, dead on course, with only 500 miles to do, halfway to my destination, in fact. True, I had taken rather longer than I had originally anticipated, but what the hell? I was making it, wasn't I? I was no mail liner, trying to work to the minute. Buller joined in the celebration by eating 2 tins of corned beef and 2 bars of chocolate. I wondered whether I should treat him to a bottle of beer. He loves beer, but decided against it, as he would probably have been sick after that lot. By the time I had finished the champagne and sung a few songs, it was midnight, and I turned in, setting the alarm clock for 6. As soon as the alarm woke me, I hurried up on deck, and had a nice surprise. There, about a quarter of a mile off to port, were 3 whales, the first I had seen, although they are pretty common in these waters. They were going along in the direction I intended to take, disappearing and coming up to blow. I sang the first bit of "You take the high road and I'll take the low road," but I had a suspicion that they would reach their destination before I did. I was cheered up no end with seeing them, and also the fact that I had reached my intended position. For no earthly reason, I was suddenly seized with an urgency, and felt that I couldn't afford to waste time, and feverishly set about setting the sails and getting under way. I was getting more handy with sail setting, and it did not take me long, and yelling out, "Here we go, Buller!" I set off in the wake of the whales. A glance at the log showed that we were doing 4 knots, and out came my pencil and paper again, and I started calculating. At this rate, it would take me 122 hours sailing, if I sailed, say, 14 hours a day. I had got 9 days to do, that is, if my speed was constant. Naturally, I hoped that I could do better than this. 9 days would be the outside maximum. If I could get up to 6 knots, then I could cut it down to 6 days. It all depended on the wind, and after that calm I had lost all faith in wind charts. After all, it says in the Bible that the wind bloweth where it listeth, and by gosh it does. Paying no attention to wind charts or anything else. Only one thing you can be sure of, and that is when nearing port you'll either get a head wind or a dead calm. Any round-the-worlder will confirm this. I messed about with the sails, trying to get an extra knot, but found that my original setting was the best. Being now in the shipping lane between East Africa and India, I kept a sharp lookout for any sort of ship, but saw nothing, although I thought that I was on my course. There was always a niggling doubt, and I was anxious to confirm my position. I kept telling myself that I had no need to worry, but there it was, that doubt, in the back of my mind. All the time, there was nothing I could do about it. But oh, what a relief it would have been had I spoken a ship and got my true position. However, I spoke nothing. I was greatly heartened about midday by coming across 2 wooden cases and a lot of orange peel that had evidently been discarded by some ship. Obviously, I was correct in assuming that I was well in the shipping lane. Several times during the day, I climbed up the main mast in the hopes of spotting a steamer or even a dhow. On one occasion, I thought I saw smoke on the horizon and felt terribly let down when it all disappeared. The truth was, I had not yet got accustomed to the loneliness. All my adult life I had lived, if not with, at least in close proximity to other men. When I had set out, I had not realized how terribly lonely the sea can be. I have been told that the captains of the very large crack liners are lonely men. That may be so, but at least such a captain can tell his first, second, and third officers to take sights. And when they have all submitted the same result, say, "Yes, I make it the same. You are all correct," even though he hasn't really taken a sight himself for the last 10 years. He can and does throw a captain's dinner, cocktail parties, give the apprentices hell, and have 101 excuses for talking to someone. But I could only throw a dinner for Buller, and though I admit that I talked to him umpteen times a day, he couldn't answer back. I found myself looking for omens. I would think, now when I open my eyes, if I see a small cloud dead ahead, I'll see a ship today, or if a shark joins us, then I shall only have 4 days to go before hitting the islands. Although I knew it was nonsense, I sort of half believed it. Anyway, it helped to pass the time. For the next 3 days, the wind held well, and I averaged 5 knots. And then it happened. What actually happened, I suppose, I shall never know. I remember setting the jib, and the next thing I remember was Buller licking my face. All that happened between these two events remains a complete blank in my memory. I had set the jib first thing in the morning of the 4th day, and I regained consciousness some time during a night. I say a night deliberately, for I must have been there some days. I came to lying flat on my back, at the bottom of the companionway. My head was lying in a pool of dried blood, and the first thing I remember was Buller licking my face, and me being dreadfully sick. I tried to sit up, but the whole cabin whirled round, and my head felt as if it were bursting. I must have lain there some time trying to gather my wits, or perhaps I lapsed unconscious again, for I seemed to come round again and again, was terribly sick. I couldn't focus my eyes. I was conscious of Buller whining and frantically licking my face, but everything seemed to be a dim dream with this awful pain in my head. After a while, I don't know how long, hours or minutes, I began to think coherently. The slightest movement sent my head into orbit, but I was able to see properly. I carefully put my hand to my head and found it encrusted with blood, so I thought I must have been here some time. I did not seem to worry about the boat, what she was doing, or where we were. All I wanted to do was to sleep, which I think I must have done. When I finally woke to full consciousness, it was the same, or the next night, I don't know. I was still lying at the bottom of the companionway, and Buller was asleep with his head on my stomach. Without thinking, I endeavored to sit up, and promptly fell on my side. I lay where I was for some time, and realized that I had a terrible thirst. Buller was prancing round me, wagging his tail, and I tried to speak to him, but my mouth was absolutely dry, and I could only manage a croak. At all cost, I had to get a drink of water. Try as I might, I could not manage to sit up without an attack of giddiness, causing me to flop over again. Well, I thought, if I can't sit up, I'll crawl. I think it must have taken me an hour to edge myself over to the tap. I'd pull myself a few inches and then have to rest, the pain in my head making further movement impossible. At last, I reached the tap in one of the tanks and managed to turn it on. I lay on my back and let the water run into my mouth. Buller, who had been anxiously watching my every movement, joined in, and he appeared to be as thirsty as I. I drank and drank and drank, letting the water splash over my face and aching head. When I could drink no more, I tried to turn off the tap, but the effort was too much for me, and I just lay there, letting the water run on my face. This felt very pleasant, and I either fell asleep or passed out again. For the next thing I remember, it was day and full noon. This time I was fully conscious, although I still had a splitting headache and felt very weak. My first thought was for the boat. She didn't seem to be moving at all, and I wondered if I was aground or in port or what. Well, it would be easy to find out. All I had to do was to climb out on deck and see. Easier said than done. It took me ages to crawl up, but Ricky, the sailor, with the stiff upper lip, managed it at last. I sat weakly in the cockpit and looked round. We were in a dead calm, not a breath of wind, not a ripple on the sea. The jib and mizzen were set, and nothing that I could see appeared to be out of place. Buller scrambled up, and I went to clip on his harness, only to find it broken. Now I had, as usual, left Buller clipped to his harness when I had been setting the jib, and it was obvious that he had eventually broken it and come down into the cabin. I began to wonder for the first time how long I had been out, and what had happened. I have often pondered this, and have come to the conclusion that I must have been going below for something, slipped and fallen onto my head. Also I reckon that I must have lain there for at least 4 days, although of that I shall never be sure, because in the first calm we had, I had stopped writing up the log, and had lost count of the days. I was thankful that we were becalmed. I could not have stuck being chucked about. My head was bad enough as it was, and I was terribly weak. Whether from loss of blood or other causes, I don't know. If I had been out for some days, and it seemed probable it might have been lack of food, coupled with loss of blood. I sat in the cockpit too weak, tired, and miserable to do anything. I longed for a cup of coffee, but couldn't bear the thought of having to make the effort of going below. It occurred to me that sitting in the sun probably was not doing my head much good, and that I ought to put a hat on. But that meant going below to get it, with all the effort it entailed. I continued to sit there until roused by Buller, who started to paw me and wag his tail. This was the way he generally reminded me that I'd forgotten his chocolate, and I realized that he was probably famished. There was nothing for it. I had to get cracking. With several pauses for rest, I managed to accomplish the feat, and opened a tin of dog food. I was right, he was starving. He ate 3 tins in record time, and drank a whole bowl of water. I thought I would give him a couple of bars of chocolate, but it was so soft that it was almost impossible to get it out of the paper. I couldn't be bothered, so slung them to him and let him get on with it. I longed to go to sleep again, but thought that I had better have something to eat first. Actually, I did not feel in the least bit hungry, but I had to do something to get back my strength. I eventually settled for a cup of Bovril, wondered whether I should lace it with rum, but decided against it, as I seemed to remember that spirits were the wrong thing to take after a bash on the head. I had 2 cups, and then got in my bunk, and was instantly asleep. Buller woke me about sundown by jumping up on the bunk. I felt a lot better, though I still had a nagging pain in my head. I also discovered that my neck ached. Also, my right shoulder was bruised. Funnily enough, I did not seem to worry at all about the boat, or where we were, or what the weather was like, or anything. Nothing seemed to matter much at all. I noticed the pool of dried blood on the floor, and wondered for the first time what I looked like. I looked into the small mirror and was horrified. My face was just a mask of dried blood. I looked like something that had escaped from the Chamber of Horrors. Blood was also clotted all over my hair. The quicker I washed, the better. It was easy enough to clean up my face, neck, and shoulders, but I was doubtful about starting on my head. I didn't want to start up the bleeding again, but at the same time, I could not leave it. I remembered reading about some lady who with her husband was also voyaging in a small yacht, and who got washed overboard, and by a chance in 100 got back again. Their yacht also turned turtle, and it was either when she went overboard or when they turned turtle that she got a terrific crack on the head, causing a nasty cut. Well, she had a theory that it was best left alone, that a scab had formed, and that nature would do the rest. She was right, it did, and she eventually suffered no ill effects. Well, what was good enough for her was certainly good enough for me. I carefully cleaned up all round where I thought the cut was, and left the rest. I may as well state here that I healed up perfectly. Surprisingly enough, I eventually found the cut was only about an inch long. Why I bled so much is a mystery. It was essential that I got fit again as soon as possible. The best thing I could think of was food for the inner man, and aspirin for the head. A manufacturer's agent in Mombasa had given me a carton of Brand's essence and another of chicken jelly, and I decided on these for a start. I didn't fancy solid food for some reason. I ate a jar of each, and was surprised to find that eating these things had made me feel hungry. I was wondering what to have when I caught sight of the mess on the cabin floor, and that put me off completely. The sooner that was cleaned up, the better. I cleaned it up, and then felt so tired I could hardly keep my eyes open. I couldn't be bothered to prepare anything to eat. I put down a tin of bully and some biscuits for Buller, took 6 aspirins, and turned in.